Good morning and welcome to the second lecture on chapter 12 related to parking studies. Today we'll be talking about some of the parking studies and its own characteristics. Some of these numbers that would tell us a lot of information related to parking studies are accumulation and duration. So the very first definition here is accumulation is simply this is the number of vehicles parked at any given time. So we know that again the parking lot can have different capacities at different timing, but if now we're assuming that for any certain time a park is coming to the facility and try to park, how many vehicles would be parking at the same time? So many parking studies try to establish that distribution of parking accumulation over time in order to determine the peak accumulation, because our goal is really to see what's the worst case scenario and how can we fit the parking needs. There is so many national studies that has been done on parking accumulation, and parking accumulation in most cities has increased over time. We can really here look at this graph here and see that with time and with the increase of number of population at any urbanized city, the accumulation parking would be going on and is going to keep going up with time. For example, in 1965, you see this line here that showed that for cities that has 10,000 thousands, which means 10 millions, we have again the accumulation was again somewhere at this stage here, which is about 50 or 60 thousands. And now the line of 1972 is getting steeper all the way to 1988 is even more steeper, including that or concluding that the parking accumulation is getting higher and higher, and it's also strongly related to the urbanized area population. For example, if we are comparing a city size similar to Tyler, which is going to be here 100,000, the accumulation is that much, which is 3 or 4,000, compared to a city that has couple million people, which is going to be sitting around this range here, and now the accumulation would be way higher. And as you could see, something interesting that the y-axis in this case is in a logarithmic scale. So once I increase the number of population by a certain amount of people, the demand for parking would be way higher. When it comes to duration is now a time. It's a length of time that individual vehicles remain parked. So now we're interested to know what's the average time that each one of these vehicles at any facility would be parking at. So average parking duration are also related to the size of the urban area, with average duration increasing with urban area population as well. As you could see in this graph, we could see that the duration is increasing by increasing the urbanized area population. For the same thing, if we pick on a city like Tyler here, this is the size of Tyler, and if you could see here, the average parking based on this study shows it's around an hour and a half, versus another city that has, let's say, a couple million people, so it's going to be somewhere around here, and now it's about 3 hours. So there is, as you see, there's a clear relationship between the increase of number of people in the city and its relation to the parking need. This table here is also very interesting to show that the average duration of parking in two different cities as well as two different times. So for example, we are comparing Boston in 1972 with Charlotte in 1987. And very interestingly, that the manager in 1972 in Boston would park for 5.5 hours, not a full day. And now in Charlotte in 1987, about 15-16 years later, now the amount of duration that the manager would stay or park their car would be 8 hours and 8 minutes. When it comes to personal business, it's very interesting that personal business now getting less and less. For example, if you are going to a doctor appointment, back in the days you would go to the doctor appointment and maybe you wait longer because you didn't make an appointment or there's no online appointments. Now, with all the business of all the tasks that we have to do in 24 hours a day, we tend to spend less time doing our personal business needs, including again doctor appointments and so on and so forth. Now the duration is dropping. Versus again, this is different types of services. Recreational services, for example, used to be 2 hours and 18 minutes, and now after again 15-16 years it's dropping to an hour and 29 minutes. So you need to keep in mind that the duration amount would depend on the time, which is again from 1972 to 1987, and the city, because from a state to a state, or from even city to a city, things may differ. So the question now, how are we gonna measure the accumulation and duration in a parking spot? Most commonly used technique for observing duration and accumulation characteristics of curb parking and surface parking lots is by simply recording the license plate numbers for the parked vehicles. Most of the time, you're not gonna note, or you're not gonna write all the plate numbers. We typically have the last 3 digits. We record the last 3 digits, as you could see here in this form. So 631, that would be the last 3 digits for that plate for that car. Something also interesting that we need to keep in mind when we do parking study, we need to keep going through the parking spot at irregular intervals ranging from 10 to 30 minutes. For example, again, this study here, as you could see, it started at 7, and now you would notice that there's a car at certain location, and then you come back at 7:30, 8, 8:30. So this study here was done every half an hour. The interval is every half an hour. While, for example, if I'm asking you to do a parking study for 1 hour, the interval will be a bit less. Typically it's every 15 minutes. Also, you could see here what do I mean by T or TK. T stands for a truck, TK is for illegally parked or ticketed vehicle. So that's also something to note. So let's here select this space. This space here, we came at 7, and we found a car that has a plate number ends with 631. A tick mark, meaning that now it's the same vehicle staying from 7 to 7:30. Now it's from 7:30 till 8. Same thing here, say that till 8:30, and now by the time we get exactly at 8:30, looks like the vehicle which ends with the plate which ends with 631 left, and now there is another car that came with the plate number 971. So the tick mark means it's the same car parking now for more than one interval, and if I just have a dash like here, that means the parking spot was empty. So how can we do the calculation? The 2 equations here that we need to obtain and we need to calculate, the first one is the average parking duration, which is D. D is simply the average parking duration, which is how many hours per vehicle. I'm interested to know every vehicle is spending how much time at the parking facility, which is equal to the summation of NX, which is number of vehicles parked for X intervals, for certain interval, times the number of that interval, number of interval parked. For example, a car may stay for, let's say if the interval is 30 minutes, and if the car stayed for an hour and a half, that means it stayed for 3 intervals. Times I, which is the length of the observation. So if I stay there for a parking facility for 6 hours, that 6 hours will be the I, the overall length of the observation, over NT. NT is the total number of parked vehicles observed during the parking study. Another characteristic that we are interested to measure and obtain is the parking turnover rate. TR, turnover rate, is equal to NT, which is the parking turnover, which is the total number of parked vehicle observed, over the multiplication of PS times TS. PS is the total number of legal parking stalls times TS, which is the duration of the study period. And we're gonna go through an example and see how are we gonna calculate these two numbers. This here, and which is table 12.7 in your textbook, shows a typical parking study field sheet for one location. This is for just one block out of several blocks in the same parking facility, because the one parking facility you cannot do it all at once. We will divide the parking facility into several blocks. So for this one here, table 12.7 is showing the information and the parking field sheet for block phase 61. And for the parking, for this parking spot or parking block that is named 61, there are that many of parking spaces. So there is parking space named 1, 2, 3, 4, and there is hydrant, and then we're having 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We are having 5 parking spots that has 1 hour limitation, and we're having 4 parking spots that has 2 hour limitation. And now we could see that the parking study that start at 8 and finished at 3, and also we can tell that the interval, it's half an hour. So I would go observe the parking block, and then I will wait for half an hour, come back and observe it again and make my observations. As I told you before, the tick mark, that means it's the same vehicle. So for example, if I wanna select or take a look at parking space number 2, at 8 a.m. there was a vehicle with a plate ending with 470. When I came at 8:30, it was staying same place, same car. That's why I put a tick mark. But when I came at 9, the vehicle now left, and there is another vehicle with a plate ends with 380. And then at 9:30, there's a dash mark. That means that parking space was empty at 9:30 as well as 10. And then when I came at 10:30, now it's another car, and so on and so forth. One of the interests of mine now is to take the summation of all the parking spaces at this parking block for every single interval. So for example, at 8 a.m. when I came in, now if I count for how many vehicles that they were occupying the block, I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. That's why I have here 6. You may wonder again why, for example, at 9:30 I have 13, because you have to include the tick marks as well as the number here, because the number indicates a brand new a car that just parked, while the tick mark meaning that there was a car from the previous interval. So I have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. So once I'm done with this table, which is for one single block face, now I can do the same thing for all the other segments for the parking facility, like what we're gonna see in the next slide. So here, now you see that the block number, which we spent again the last 5-10 minutes talking about it, is one single line now in this table. And now I'm having also the other block numbers. So I have 62, 63, all the way to 181. And now I will have a summation of all the accumulation for the entire parking facility, knowing that this is here the total number of stalls. It can handle 1500 vehicles at any time. So at 8, for example, at 8 a.m. there were 806 vehicles at the parking facility, compared to 900 at 8:30, 1106 at 9. And now if we keep going, we would be interested to know what was the peak time. The peak time looks like it was at 11 a.m. where I had 1410 vehicles occupying the parking facility. But the good thing is the 1410 are still less than the available 1500 total stalls, and therefore the parking is doing fine. Another table that we also are interested to summarize is this. We need to summarize the field sheets for duration distribution. I'm also interested to know how many cars they parked for one interval, which is half an hour, and how many cars did they stay there for 2 intervals, 3 intervals, all the way to 6 intervals, which means 3 hours. So once I'm done with this, also I can take the summation for one interval versus versus the car that will stay for 2 intervals, and so on and so forth, until I get the summation of all these numbers to get that there is 2,119 total parkers were observed. So now once we are having again the understanding of the two equations, now for convenience only the last, again as I said, 3 numbers of the license plates has to be recorded. In most of the states, the initial 2 or 3 letters or numbers represent a code indicating where the plate registration was issued. Thus, these letters or numbers are often repetitive for many plates. That's why we don't include them. And now how can we get the average duration? So the average duration, if you go back to the equation, is going to be, well, now we're going to follow 875. This is how many vehicles who stayed for one interval times 1. This is one interval times 0.5. This is 0.5 hours, half an hour. And also we had 490 vehicles who stayed for 2 intervals times 0.5. And the list go all the way until we had 28 vehicles times 6 who stayed for 6 intervals times 0.5, which is half an hour. So here really, when I really multiply 3 times 0.5 or 2 times 0.5, here I'm multiplying the number of intervals times the interval length, so which is basically giving me a total amount of time that each one of these vehicles stayed over the total number of vehicles observed, and this would give us the average duration. So on average, every vehicle is staying there for 1.1 hours. So a vehicle would come on average, stay there for 1.1 hours and then leave. The turnover is also something interesting that we need to get, which is 2119, which is the total number of vehicles observed over the 1500. What's the 1500? 1500 is the total number of stalls available times 7, because now the observation time for the parking study was 7. So we're saying overall I had 1500 times 7 spaces for 7 hours and during the 7 hours, and the total number of vehicles observed was 2119. So that gives me on average that 0.2 vehicle per stall per hour. So on average, every parking spot would handle 0.2 vehicles every hour. That also gives you an indication, which is go hand in hand with the duration, that looks like this parking facility is handling short-term parking, the stages for an hour. A vehicle would leave and another vehicle would come and occupy the same place, and so on and so forth. We're also interested to measure the maximum accumulation occurs, which happened to be at 11 a.m. We had 1410 vehicles. That represent again the usage. So it was 1410 over the total number of stalls that we can handle, which is 1500 times 100%. That means there were again 94% of available spaces were occupied. But on the other hand, again, that means that there were still 6% not occupied. That means the parking facility is handling the demand very well. Now let's shift gears to the design aspects of parking facilities. When it comes to off-street parking facilities, those parking facilities are provided at surface lots or parking garages. Most of the time, those surface lots are considerably cheaper than garages, and the surface lots cost typically somewhere between 1,000 and 3,000 per space provided. Garages are really more complex, and below ground garages are far more costly than above ground structures. So to give you again a cost perspective, typical cost for above ground garages range from $8,000 to $15,000 per space, while when it comes to below ground garages, it may cost between $20,000 and $35,000 per space. So again, that shows you the increase of the cost of the parking from a surface lot to a garage to a below ground garage. So the decision of how to provide off-street parking involves so many considerations. As a traffic engineer, we have to think of including factors such as availability of land, amount of parking needed, and the cost to provide it. For example, if you are in a city, packed city, very urbanized, there is not much spaces, then there's not much of availability for the land, and therefore you have to think of below ground garages, for example. And also you need to keep in mind how many parking spots do you need versus the cost available to you to come up with this parking facility. So there are three major objectives in the design of any parking facility that you have to keep in mind as a traffic engineer. First, it must be convenient and safe for the intended users. Proximity to major destination, as well as adequate access and egress facilities is very important. Also, you have to keep in mind that these parking facilities should be space efficient and economical to operate. If it's super expensive, people are gonna now ignore the place, or maybe again not even going to that business center at all. So efficient internal circulation system has to be there, adequate stall dimensions, and basic security. So again, efficiency and economy. Economy, is it affordable or not? And efficiency, if I want to get to that parking spot, if there is a circulation system, or is there just one exit? Do I have enough space for my car? And also, do I have enough security? Do I feel secure if I'm parking at the 5th or 7th story building parking location? Do I have enough security? The third objective also, these parking facilities should be compatible with its environments. So security against theft of vehicles and security for, again, muggings and other personal crimes. Again, that's part of security. Parking spots has to be always monitored, and the sense of security has to be high at those locations to let people park safely at these locations. So speaking of dimensions, now let's talk about basic parking dimensions. So based on one of two design vehicles, where you typically have either large or small vehicles, or large or small cars. Some parking facilities, they try to make sure to use separated parking areas for small cars to maximize the total parking capacity. So that's one of the techniques. So as you could see here, I'm giving you some information related to the design dimensions for parking facility for large cars versus small cars. So one of the important dimension is the width of the car, W. So for small cars, it's 66. This is the recommendation, 66 inches versus 77 inches for large cars. When it comes to the length of the car, that's L. It's 175 for small cars versus 215 inches for large cars, all the way to informations like rear radius, for example, in feet. For small cars, they just need again 15 feet as rear radius versus 17.4. One of the big components when it comes to the parking facility dimensions is the parking stall width, W, like what we talked about it in a second. It must be wide enough to encompass the vehicle and allow door opening clearance. It's not just the width of the vehicle, because you apparently have to open the vehicle to leave the car. So we have to have a minimum of door opening clearance of 22 inches. But this again may be increased to 26 inches where turnover rates are high. Because if trucks, the turnover rate that we just talked about, if the trucks again are they would stay for half an hour or less than that and just keep going back and forth. That means there is a lots of turnover rates and therefore the spacing, because now that means that there is a hurry leaving the car or getting into the car. So we have to have that more space. Only one door though, one door opening clearance is provided per stall because the parked vehicle and its adjacent neighbor can use the same clearance space. So for example, for large cars, the parking stall width should range from 77 inches, which is I provided to you in the previous table, plus 22 inches, and that would give us 99 inches, which is about 8.25 feet. When it comes to the maximum amount of width, it's 77 plus 26, which is 103 inches, which is 8.58 feet. So those here the minimum and the maximum width for large cars. Here now in this table I'm showing you that there are 4 parking classes depending on turnover rates and typical users. So if I have here the parking class A, B, C, and D, the stall width that can go from as high as 9 feet and as low as 8.25 feet depending on the typical, again, turnover. If it's a low turnover and the parking class is C or D, so the width again is 8.5 versus 8.25, while if the turnover is really high, the stall width would go all the way to 9 feet. Typical usages, again, for parking class A, this is the retail customers, bank, fast foods, other very turnover facilities. When it comes to parking class D, this is here really industrial, universities, commuters, where turnover is very low. You would just park your car for several hours, and therefore there is not the urge of having to have high width for the stall is less, and that's why it's 8.25 feet. Versus if you are just going to an ATM in the front of a bank while you're in your car, the turnover is really high and the stall width is high. So for small cars, the parking stall width between 66 plus 22, which is 88 inches, all the way to 66 plus 26 inches, which is 92 inches. So, and again, that would lead us to that the design standard for small cars is typically 7.6 foot. So 7.6 foot, that's the typical design width for small cars. When it comes to the parking stall length and depth, it has to be measured parallel to the parking angle. Generally speaking, it's taken as the length of the design vehicle plus 6 inches bumper clearance. So whatever the length of the vehicle plus 6 inches for bumper clearance. So a length of, for example, 215 inches for large cars, like what we mentioned in the previous table, plus 6 inches, that's gonna give us the length. Recommended length for the parking stall has to be 221 inches, which is 18.4 feet. And when it comes to small cars, it's 175 plus 6 inches, and that would be 181 inches, which is 15.1 feet. When it comes to the depth of the parking stall is the 90 degrees projection of the design vehicle length plus 6 inches bumper clearance. So that's here the rule of thumb when it comes to the depth. It's as simple as that. Just the parking stall is 90 degrees projection of the design vehicle length plus 6 inches bumper clearance. When it comes to, now we're done with the parking stall dimension, now the aisle width. The aisle width is also very important. Aisles must be sufficiently wide to allow drivers to enter and leave parking stalls safely and conveniently in a minimum number of maneuvers. I'm pretty sure all of us have been into those parking facilities or parking spots that you would spend 5 to 10 minutes doing lots of maneuvers back and forth to fit your car perfectly in that spot. And it shouldn't be this way. We should have enough aisle width to let us maneuver easily and park right there. Aisles, there's at least have to have 1 on entry and 2 on departures. As stalls as the parking stalls become narrower, aisles need to be a bit wider. So this is here the balance that you have to keep in mind. If you are having very tiny parking stalls, you have to have a wider aisles. Aisles also carry circulating traffic and accommodate pedestrians walking to and from the vehicles that they own. So you have to keep that in mind, that it has to be wide enough to handle lots of pedestrians leaving their cars or getting into their cars. Aisle width also has to depend on the angle of parking and on whether the aisle serves one-way or two-way traffic. In so many parking facilities, the aisle is designed only for one way, and therefore the width will be significantly smaller compared to other aisles that they are handling two-way traffic. So that also has to be accommodated. Now moving to parking modules or parking designs, or overall designs. There are four different ways of laying out a module or parking module. Module, it has to reflect only a single set of stalls against a wall, or it can be a wall-to-wall double-loaded aisle, or if one set of stalls is against a wall while the another is interlocked. And the fourth style would be if both sets stalls are interlocked. For example, stalls interlock with those of the next adjacent parking module. And you would always again running into operating problems with separate parking areas. That's also something debatable, whether we have to keep large cars parking spots away from small cars. And for that case, again, large cars try to force themselves sometimes into small car stalls, and small cars on the other hand try to occupy large car stalls. So there is always have been a lot of debate whether or not we have to have separate parking spots for large cars versus small cars, because in so many places this idea didn't really work. So this is here what I was telling you about. Those are the different parking modules. W1, which is the first module here, is simply again wall-to-wall single loaded aisle. W2, which is in this case here, this is wall-to-wall double-loaded aisles. W3, this is parking module with wall-to-wall interlock double-loaded, and W4 here, this is double-loaded aisles interlock to interlock. So going back to the debate that we said, do we have to have separate parking spots for large cars versus small cars? So when it comes to this debate, some designers advocate using single size for all parking stalls. Ideally, large cars dimensions would be provided in this case for all the spaces, and the policy is typically known as OSFA, one size fits all. So basically we're trying to come up with a uniform stall and modular dimensions that are taken to be the weighted average of small as well as large car criteria. In some cases, some traffic engineers have advocated this policy as a means of providing more efficient use of scarce off-street parking spaces. But however, again, all of the problems, however, associated with large cars attempting to use small car spaces and aisles would exist throughout such facility. So there's always going to be some issues, but again, some engineers would advocate having again one size fits all. But the problem, again, large cars trying to fit through those spaces might be an issue. While the other way of thinking, or the other way of school of thought when it comes to parking facility design, is let's just separate small and large vehicle areas. So when it comes to this school of thought, there are different techniques for separating small versus large vehicle stalls. The very first technique is let's have a complete separation of small and large size vehicles. So that means this is going to indicate that maximum parking layout efficiency can be obtained by completely separating small and large vehicle parking areas, while the other technique is mixing small and large size spacing and altering rows. So in this case, the large and small cars modules are alternated, producing about 50-50 split in the number of each type of stall. The third way of separating small and large vehicles are small and large size spaces in the same row. So how does that happen? Basically, a portion of each row is allotted to each type of vehicle. So if we have one single row, half of the row would be for small cars and the half of the row would be for large cars. While the fourth technique here is cross aisle separation, where we're gonna have small car stalls are provided on one side of the aisle and a large car stalls are provided on the other side. So again, several techniques here to separate small and large vehicles. One, you can have in summary complete separation of small and large spaces. Second, mixing small and large spaces and alternating rows. Third, small and large size spaces in the same row, or I can have cross aisle separation. This is here just again a picture of how can we make use of the four previously mentioned separating the small versus large car techniques. So we can see here we can have this is some separation. Again, full cars would be here, and the width again of the aisle center to center is 61 feet compared to small ones. So here we're having alternating full versus small, full and small. Or we can have the same row. As you could see here, the same row is going to handle half of the row is small versus the other half is full, but now we need to make sure that the width center to center is high to fit the big cars. Or we can have again one row for full and with an angle to give them more maneuvering space, versus the small cars is just 90 degrees projection angle. And again, this is how can we mix the two together. Here now we can come back and use the somewhere in between 51 and 61 feet distance, because now the full cars are gonna have 45 degrees angle to maneuver, which is gonna make it easier, and therefore we don't need that much of a high distance or high width anymore of the aisle. So again, those are some of the techniques, and this is the table that shows you the parking module layout dimensions guidelines. When it comes to the parking garages, the structure of a parking garage represent additional constraints now, such as the building dimensions and the location of the structural columns and other features. Because imagine now all of a sudden we are in a building, and in the building you would see columns, you would see certain extra constraints that wasn't there and one level parking facility. Ideal model and stall dimensions must sometimes be compromised and in fact to work around these structural features. So parking garages have the additional burden of providing vertical as well as horizontal circulations for vehicles. It's not just about again the horizontal circulation, now it's vertical, since we're gonna handle again several floor plans that can handle hundreds and hundreds of cars. So this really now is going to involve a general design and layout that has to include a ramp system, and at least where self-parking is involved. So if we're having self-parking, not a valet parking, we have to have again ramp system included in the design. How to lay out a parking garage is by looking at these different styles. Again, and this is in your textbook. I'm gonna leave it to you to look at the different styles of how can we implement different styles. We have here we have 12 different types of designs that can be implemented. It really depend on the constraints of the building and the amount of parking spots that you need to provide, and whether you're gonna have one exit versus two exits, and so other aspects. So with this, again, we finish this chapter about the parking studies and how can we design a parking facility, and with all the statistics required, as well as the parking design styles that we can select from. Thank you so much.